Shalom, and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamet, and joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanowski of Solomon Shechter of Long Island and Anshe Chesed, respectively. And it's great to see you guys.
It's great to see you.
We are talking about a great Parsha this week. They're all great Parshas. I always feel like when we say great Parsha, it's not fair because they're all great.
Until we get to Vayikra.
Until we get, come on. Tazria Mitzora, the best. We did that.
Even then it's great because the truth is that everything is meaningful. It's just sometimes it's more obvious and sometimes you have to dig a little more.
Sometimes you do have to dig. So here, what makes this Parsha beautiful is it's got all the elements of life in it: death, burial, love, romance, courtship, journey, character, humor. Let's talk. Let's begin. So we start out with the Parsha. Tell us, Barry Chesler, tell us how the Parsha begins. What's the report?
So last week we ended with Akedat Yitzchak, the sacrifice of Isaac, and all of a sudden Sarah is dead. And there are two interpretations the rabbis offer for her death right after the Akedah. In one, she finds out that Isaac has miraculously survived, and her heart bursts from joy. And in the other one, she despairs over the loss of her son, who was born to her in her old age, and she dies of heartbreak. But in either case, it presents Abraham with a problem. He is a sojourner in the land, and he needs to bury his wife. And so he goes to Ephron HaChitti, the Hittite, and seeks to secure a parcel of land where he could bury his wife. And that is Marat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah, which exists still today and became the burial site not only of Abraham and Sarah, but of Yitzchak and Rivka, and of Yaakov and Leah. And that's where we begin. And then the Torah begins with that curious verse that Sarah died at the age of 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. And Rashi comments that she was as sinless at 100 as she was at 20, and as beautiful at 20 as she was at 7, basing himself on a passage in Breshit Rabbah. But it's a kind of curious comment that Rashi makes, because one would think that a 7-year-old is more sinless than a 20-year-old, and a 20-year-old more beautiful than a 7-year-old. But there we have it.
Can we talk for a second about the age? Because she's 127 years old, and if you follow the rabbinic midrash here, that means that Isaac was 37 years old at the Akedah. I don't know how, Jeremy, how do you feel about that? How do you react to a 37-year-old man?
Yeah, it doesn't really enhance one's understanding of the Akedah, the gentleness of Vayomer Yitzchak El Avi, Vayomer Avi, Vayomer Hineni Beni. And Isaac says to his father, he says, "Father," and father says, "Here I am, my son." It's quite hard to imagine that story making sense if Yitzchak is a full-grown adult. And
I have to disagree when you're done.
Okay, that's good. The disagreement is good. You know, it seems like the midrashic tail is wagging the pshatic dog.
I have another theory, but go ahead, Barry.
Okay, so in the Torah, it's presented as a test of Abraham. And Abraham is the main character, and Isaac is actually incidental to the story. He's like a catalyst. But for the rabbis, it's Akedat Yitzchak, because the real hero of the story is Yitzchak, who submits to his father. And that takes far more, I think, to imagine a 37-year-old man getting up on the altar and willingly submitting to his father raising a knife against him. And I think that that's what appealed to the rabbis, and that's why Nisayon Avraham becomes Akedat Yitzchak, because they shift the focus.
I have a different take on this. Of course,
because your name is Yitzchak. That's why.
Yitzchak, and of course, it's I can't shake the impression that the text is making of a little boy, and so I picture Yitzchak in the Akedah about 6 or 7 years old, because that's he responds at that level. So if we were to play it out, that Sarah dies at 127 and Isaac was 6 at the Akedah, and she got information that Abraham went to sacrifice him when he was 6, that means that she would have to live 30 something years, 31 years, knowing that her husband was about to kill her son. I think that knowledge is just too much to bear. And I think the rabbis have of course, the text justifies it because of the connection, the juxtaposition. But the deeper level here is that they have Rahmanas on her. She doesn't have to live with the terror of the knowledge as it is. Anybody who reads the text for the first time is plagued with questions about the relationship between Abraham and Sarah. After all, here at the beginning of this Parsha, so what does it say? Bikiryat Arba hi Chevron. And so he is where? He's in Beersheba and she's in Hebron. Last time I checked, they're far away. You got to take a whole bus to get from Beersheba to Hebron.
You got to change. You got to change the bus.
Exactly. It's, and it's a huge journey. They're living in separate houses. They're living in separate tents. They're sleeping in separate beds. There's
a penetrating insight from Shalom Paul I heard many years ago. So the Akedah concludes with Abraham returning by himself. Yeah. And Shalom Paul's explanation was that once your father raises a knife to you, you have nothing to say to that person ever again. And they could not go back together. But I want to pick up on something else, Elliot, because if we pursue the chronology, if Isaac is 37 and Rivka is born at the end of the Parsha, so when he gets married at 40, Rivka is only 3.
Right.
And that is, shall I say, kind of twisted, but that's codified in Jewish law because that's the age of betrothal.
Indeed. Okay, so they're in a box there. This is probably, this is the problem with biblical chronology. Everything else works out, provided you accept these little things here. That Yitzchak is 37 and Akedah, and Rebecca is 3 years old when she's betrothed, 3 years old when she sees, and hopefully we'll get to the passage where she really speaks for herself and at this,
she's quite eloquent at 3.
At 3 years old, she's the most formidable of the matriarchs. Okay, so anybody want to tackle the negotiation between Abraham and Ephron the Hittite?
I have only one thing to say about it, which is a little small point of comparison. In a certain sense, there are 2 broad approaches to Jewish religion. It's this family clan tradition, and it's a Torah religious message of an encounter with God. And both of them are obviously indispensable. We have to be Am Yisrael. We have to be in a covenant with God. But when David will buy the Goren Ornan, when he will buy the threshing house of Ornan HaYevusi to build the temple, he spends 50 shekel kesef. Mm-hmm. And when Abraham buys the kever, buys the grave in the Me'arat HaMachpelah for burial, for like the rootedness of his family, is 400 shekel kesef. So in a sense, there is the Torah's or the Tanakh's priorities about what is really, really definitive about this people's hold in the promised land, in the sacred land. Is it the temple site, which cost 50 shekels, or is it the grave site, which cost 400 shekels? Now, we live in a time in 2020, after Baruch Goldstein and the complicated political things about Hebron and whatever. So I don't want to fall into a trap of putting too much weight on, this Torah story for our political, describing political realities. But I think this is really important, that the Torah's view about our ancestors' burial is actually 8 times more important than the space for the sacred temple.
So it raises a question, because all the numbers in Breshit are kind of out of whack. The generations between Adam and Noach lived for hundreds and hundreds of years, from 969 of Methuselah to 365 of Hanoch, who lives less than anyone else, but still far longer than any of us live. So I wonder if the 400 shekel is just part of Breshit's inflation of numbers. I had a friend in high school who used to begin stories. If it was about a bicycle, for example, he would say, imagine the biggest bicycle you could imagine. In my story, this one is bigger. And so it's like the 400 shekel is like this inflated sum, because perhaps it wasn't meant to be taken quite so seriously, but it was just to make a larger point about value.
No, I disagree. What I want to say is that there is, reading through the negotiation, there's the Abraham's interest is to establish unquestionable title to the land, to the property, and he is willing to pay an inflated price in order to establish incontrovertibly, his ownership of the property. Look, Ephron is willing to say, "Oh, I'll give you the land. Go. You can bury her among us. We're close. And he's like, nothing doing. I want to give you money for it. And then he's whining for it. And what's a small piece of land worth 400 shekels? So, so he gives the price, and Abraham seizes the price immediately, and that way it establishes incontrovertible title to the land.
So the expression that's used over and over again for people that die is that they sleep with their fathers. And your suggestion then, Elliot, is that you can only sleep with your fathers on land that you own.
That's 100% correct. I actually think that is exactly the message, that the only thing, and we can say this in poetic language, the only thing that you can't take it with you, you can't take your car with you, and you can't take your widescreen TV with you, but you actually, the only thing you ever really own is your Dalet Amot of your grave. And I think that the Torah is portraying Abraham as wanting to own it in a deep and serious way.
It's so interesting because we deal a lot with burial and in the pulpit rabbinate, and from time to time we'll get out to the cemeteries, and they have large family monument plot, mausoleum, things, and people don't do that anymore. They don't buy, big, there are 12 plots, 18 plots, 20 plots, in a certain area. People will buy for them and their spouse, and they assume that their children are going to be elsewhere at this point. I don't know of anybody who buys a large number of plots. In fact, what happens is it happens regularly. People call or email and say, I have a plot to donate. What should we do with it? It's in my family plot, but it's empty. Nobody's in there. And so we will gladly take, discretionary plots from people in case, people don't have the ability to pay for a plot. We'll provide them a.
Actually, on Sunday I have a funeral, and the deceased arranged, prepaid and arranged her own funeral before, and I'm just like trying to place yourself in that person's, in the experience of that. Okay, I'm making arrangements for my own burial.
Yeah.
And I think that's if you think about it, if you reflect on it, that's actually an incredibly profound spiritual model. And Abraham in this story, he is dealing with the fact, Vayavo lispod Sarah v'livkota, he has to come all the way from Beersheba. He's got this terrible thing, and he has to mourn Sarah and give her eulogy. But he's also buying his own grave, and he's buying the grave of his child and daughter-in-law and grandchild and granddaughter-in-law. And I think that's actually quite profound.
So
what adds to the profundity, I think, is that we think of death as being the end, but for Abraham, this is the beginning, because he's buying the grave, the Kever Machpelah, Marada Machpelah, for the future, not for the past.
Totally correct. By the way, also in the this may also be in the regular rabbinic midrash, but it is certainly in the Zohar, is that that Abraham, Vayaratz Avraham el habakar, back with the angels last week, Abraham runs to the bakar, and they scramble up the letters, and he's Vayaratz Avraham el hakever. He ran towards the grave, and he saw a light, and he saw that Adam and Eve were also buried there, which makes this a really profound meditation on mortality. Like, you see that you are Ben Adam. you see that you are ben Chava,
That's
you're
beautiful.
a child of the humanity, and you're going to have to walk through this light. We're religious people, so we think that there's a light between this world and the next. And Abraham is oriented towards that piece of destiny. You know, we're going to talk on now. The story is going to go, and now I get to ask a question. The story is going to go. Abraham arranges for Sarah to die, and he knows that he is himself about to die, and he calls his servant to do him a mission, and he makes him swear. He makes him testify, as the tradition goes. It's Simna yadcha tachat rechi, place your hand beneath my thigh.
Testify.
Testify. It's the thigh region. You know, that's how they did it in the ancient world. Is that they testified by grabbing onto certain testimonial parts of the body, and Abraham sends off his servant. And Rabbi Malamit, why don't you tell us your view of what it is that Abraham wants of the servant, and what it is that makes the servant kind of special?
I think Abraham is really charging the servant, who we're calling Eliezer because he's named in a different place, although it may not be. He's saying, look, you are in charge of the destiny of my family. And what I want you to do is I want you to get a bride, a woman for my son to marry. This is a woman that should not be from the stock of anybody in this land. Let me pull up the text. So it says here, Adonai Elohei Shamayim Asher lakachani mibeit avi, God who took me from my land, my father's household, and from my place of birth. I want you to go back to that place. He says, Lo tikach isha livni mibnot haknaani, do not take any woman for my son from the Canaanites, asher ani yoshev asher anochi yoshev b'krbo, among whom I'm dwelling. Ki el artzi ve'el moladati telech. You will go back to my eretz and my moledet, and of course we hear the echo of lech lecha me'artzecha me'moladetecha, and you'll get the woman there. And so, to make a long story short, he loads up a big caravan, 10 camels, and he goes and he makes this bargain. He says, the woman that's going to come out and provide for me and for my camels, that will be the woman. And of course, we discovered that she is Rebecca. She is Abraham's relative. She is the daughter of Bethuel, or granddaughter of Bethuel, daughter of Bethuel.
Yeah, granddaughter, right?
Granddaughter of Bethuel, although there's a different tradition. And what ensues is, it's not a negotiation. As soon as she presents to Eliezer with kindness by providing all this water, Eliezer is just elated with joy. And you got to admit, this is such a beautiful story. It's placed here. It's the longest chapter in the book of Genesis, one of the longest in the entire Torah, and it's placed here, I think, as a bridge between the generations, and really establishes fundamentally the centrality of marriage in the worldview of the Torah, and also of love, of relationship, and of the sense that that destiny brought these two individuals together, despite the fact that Abram had to dispatch his servant to get her. It's just a wonderful story.
Now, I thought that we emphasized in the previous stories about Abraham that he had to leave all that behind. He had to leave his Beit Av and his Eretz and his Moledet, and now Abraham is retrojecting back to those same people in those same places. Why do you think that's the case?
I wouldn't look at it as retrojection. I would say that there is definitely a value in what's the familiar, in family. These people are family to him. Not only that, but there is a subtle tension going on. It's not subtle. I mean, it's low. Lo tikach isha livni mibnot haknaani. Okay, so do not take a woman for my son from the Canaanites girls. I don't want just any ordinary Canaanite girl for him. Why? there are plenty of commentaries and midrashim that say they're idolaters, they have bad values, they're evil. As my late grandmother would say, feh, feh on the Canaanites. Feh, we don't like them. They're awful people. So we can do that. But I think there's something much more profound going on there, which is that when you are just a little person, when you have, you're a small entity, and your child marries in the larger entity, the pressure of assimilation is much, much more profound. So that means that for Abraham, his son is still vulnerable to assimilating to the dominant culture. And the dominant culture is not going to be the culture that ensures the covenant. That's also true for Yaakov. Yaakov is actually the same words. Don't take a woman from the Canaanites to marry, precisely because you will assimilate. When you are a family, when you are a clan, when you are the Kennedys, when you are the Kushners, when you are name your family, right? You marry into that family and you assimilate into the larger family. When you are a critical mass, by the time Jacob has 12 sons and one daughter, it's a substantial family. He does not direct his children to marry only within kith and kin. He doesn't say anything. They do end up marrying. They end up marrying Canaanites. We know that Judah married a Canaanite. We know that Joseph married an Egyptian. The reason is because they are secure, they're a family, and they understand that any woman coming into a family with 12 men is going to assimilate into that family.
So what's striking is that Yaakov is commanded not to marry a Canaanite because his brother is married too.
His brother's married to
yeah,
him.
And the consolation prize is for him to marry a daughter of Ishmael.
Yeah.
Right, when he wants to make amends with, so he finds someone within the family, but not quite part of the family to marry as well. Because there is this tension between the family and the nation that plays itself out in Sefer Breshit. It's a struggle to become a nation.
So what's interesting?
Tell me a little bit about the woman that he actually marries, or the girl. Depending if we count rabbinic chronology, she's quite a young girl, but that doesn't appear to be true in the story, as we said. I have a congregant, by the way, who's a sculptor, and he's got a spectacular sculpture of the young Rebecca carrying the pitcher on her head and the little goat frolicking around her feet. Tell me a little bit, Barry, about Rivka and why she gets chosen.
I think there are two things that recommend her, a before and an after. So the test is that Eliezer, we'll call him that because we can't call him Elliot, but Eliezer says, whoever will give me water as well as my camels. So she's a Balat Chesed. She's not only concerned about human welfare, but also about animal welfare as well. And that speaks volumes to Eliezer, and I think it should speak volumes to us, because she might want to please the stranger who comes, obviously laden with a lot of things, but she's also concerned about the animals. She treats them as living beings. But the other thing I think that sometimes we don't pay enough attention to is when she's given the choice of staying for a few days or going, she says, I'm ready to go now.
That's a critical moment.
And that willingness to go also speaks volumes, because Rivka is pointed towards the future.
So it's verse 58. Vayikre'u Rivka, they speak to her. Vayomru eleha, they ask her, Hatelchi im ha'ish hazeh. Are you going to go with this guy? Vatomer elech. In one word, she says it all. So all of Jewish destiny depends on Rebecca. This is what's so critical, what's so amazing about this character. She turns out, I think we all agree, as the most formidable of the matriarchs.
Totally agree. I feel that in a sense, even the three most important, not now calling patriarchs, matriarchs a gender divide, but the three most important ancestors are Abraham, Rebecca, and Jacob, because the Torah is telling a story that all of our most important people have to make a journey. And Abraham has to leave a parent's house, and Rebecca has to leave a parent's house, and Jacob having fled the murderous Esau. He's in Mesopotamia. He has to leave a parent-in-law's house with his wives who are leaving their parents' house. To be a biblical, ancestral founding figure, you have to go on this difficult hero's journey. And Isaac, I'm not God forbid to be denigrating of Yitzchak Avinu, but he is the weakest of the patriarchs. He doesn't have to make the journey that every other one does have to make, and it is a statement about their power, strength, and exactly as Barry just said. She says Abraham was told Lech Lecha, and I volunteer lalechet. I want to go. I'm a traveler.
She's the inverse of Abraham. Well, let me as a Yitzchak, let me speak in defense of Yitzchak, okay? And of course, we totally understand. We Yitzchaks of the world totally understand the idea of drama and adventure and journey in the establishment of personality. But there's also something to be said for rootedness, for continuity, for being the figure understanding willy-nilly that he is the transitional figure. And in a sense, the father and the son are much larger than life characters. He has to know that his father is just larger, much more charismatic, much more interesting a character. And of course, having experienced the Akedah, what it did to him, who knows? And he sees that his son, he doesn't see by the time his son emerges into maturity, as we'll see next week, he is a bit blind to reality also. But
he's contained by the land, but he's also constrained by the land.
Yes.
He does so much that Abraham does. He digs the same wells that Abraham does, and he does the same thing with his wife that Abraham does.
Sure.
So he doesn't really have a chance to emerge into his own. But I like what you said about being a transitional figure, because what's important about transitional figures, I think their greatness is that they recognize that they are transitional and they don't attempt to be more than they can be.
Indeed.
Are you talking about the president-elect?
Well, we weren't going to go there, okay, but that's true. In some ways, he already recognizes that. But maybe we have a couple of minutes left. We got to talk about the death of Abraham, or just the last act. The last act. He has a wife, another wife. He gets busy. He has a lot of children. I would say when you all add them all up, there are about a dozen people that emerge with all sorts of grandchildren and the combination there. I think the signal is that he establishes another nation. And then he dies, 175 years old, 5 times 7, 7 times 5 squared, a nice round number. And who comes to bury him?
Both of his sons.
This is really amazing because Genesis, we all know, is the family stories in Genesis. They're like, they're wrenching, they're lacerating, as you imagine yourself to be Ishmael, the child banished by the parent and left to die of thirst in the desert, and Isaac, bound on the altar, and Isaac, who loves one child and not another, Rebecca, who loves one child and not another, Jacob, who favors some children. Everybody's miserable. And yet you have these moments, these redemptive moments, such as this one, when Yishmael and Yitzchak come together to bury Abraham. They discover that there's some reconciliation, and it's really quite, we need it so much. We need it so much that the children of Yitzchak and the children of Yishmael might be able to have some sense of togetherness.
And to bring it back to where we began, they have this moment of redemption, of community in the same place. They come back to the cave that Abraham bought and where he buried his wife in order to bury him. And they forge that link. That's what is going to make the cave theirs. It's not just Abraham's, but it becomes
Everybody's.
Isaac's, and it will become Yaakov's as well. And nowadays, of course, it's a matter of political dispute whose it is, but the symbol is a symbol of hope and of peace, that it can be the place where different people can come together and acknowledge that they are part of one family.
So that's a good place where we can end this edition of Parsha Talk in the moment of culmination, a moment that looks forward to peace. We want to remind our loyal listeners and thank them that they can communicate with us at parshatalk@gmail.com, Parsha, Parsha, talk@gmail.com. We love your letters and emails, and we look forward to responding to them. We're also remembering, I think Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, a formidable figure in the Jewish world, passed away last Shabbat, deeply influential in so many realms, and especially Parsha commentary. So with all of that, we want to wish everyone Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I want to point out here, guys, that we got one Yitzchak and two Yaakovs
There
here
you
in
go.
the conversation.
All right, next week is your week then.
That's right.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.